Hello class, welcome to Thorax Unit Part 3. This will be Thorax Viscera Part 2, which is just the mediastinum. So again, we have your objectives, not as many. This will be a more straightforward lecture. But this will be a continuation of what we talked about with the lungs. So we already mentioned that the thoracic cavity has a right side and a left side pleural cavity, and we talked about that central mediastinal component. Right, and so what that means is really just an area that kind of comprises all the main organs, structures, and vessels from the central thoracic cavity, as well as the most important structure, you could argue, is the heart. So it's located between both pleural cavities. It starts at the thoracic aperture inlet superiorly, which is basically just the junction of your first rib and manubrium, and goes all the way down to the diaphragm and is attached to that. So we'll actually see that the pericardial sac is adheres tightly to our diaphragm. And that's all going to be part of the mediastinum. And we have that is going to be comprised into different segments. We refer to it as being either superior mediastinum, let me get my marking right, or an inferior mediastinum. And the inferior will actually further divide. But as far as anterior and posterior boundaries go, anteriorly goes up into the sternum, and posteriorly it goes towards the costal component of the thoracic vertebrae. So you can kind of see a nice cross section here. So again, like I mentioned, the superior mediastinum, if we're trying to divide that up, we will refer to that as coming from the thoracic inlet, which we'll define that shortly by the end of this lecture. And it goes all the way to the transverse thoracic plane, which is kind of that sternal angle region. The inferior mediastinum is from that thoracic transverse thoracic plane, which is our T4 region, sternal angle, and goes all the way down to the diaphragm. So be mindful of those boundaries. It'll help you kind of separate what organs and what structures we should be identifying into each. So let's go ahead and first look at the superior mediastinum. So the first things we want to look at are what organs would you find if you're looking at the superior mediastinum, and that's going to be the thymus, the trachea, and the esophagus. So the trachea we already looked at. We'll talk briefly about the thymus shortly. The arteries that we're more interested in is the aortic arch, which is coming just off the heart. We also get the brachiocephalic trunk, which is going to be part of the aortic arch, as well as the left common carotid and left subclavian artery. So those are the three main branches that we see coming off the aortic arch, and those are residing in our superior mediastinum. As far as veins and lymphatics, you'll actually see the brachiocephalic veins, so it's a left and right brachiocephalic vein that are going to be merging into our superior vena cava. We'd also have the superior vena cava, where just the junction of those brachiocephalics. And then the thoracic duct is something we'll look at shortly when we look at the posterior mediastinum, and that's where the lymphatics are going to come. So that's a major lymphatic duct that's going to drain into our venous supply. Some of the nerves that you're going to see are actually nerves that are going to basically just descending from the neck, heading down to the thoracic area and maybe even to the abdominal region. So we're going to have the vagus nerve, we're going to have our parasympathetic fibers, our phrenic nerve, which we saw is going to be major motor innervation to our diaphragm. We're going to get our cardiac plexus, which is basically just a network of sympathetic nerves lying on top of our mediastinum here. And then you're going to get left recurrent laryngeal. That may be thinking, like, why isn't the right recurrent laryngeal here? And we'll actually take a look at that later, as we see that the right is actually going to curve up a little bit higher and not really make its way into the superior mediastinum. And then finally, the only other things to talk about is the thoracic duct, which I already mentioned is part of the lymphatics and the venous return, but sometimes other structures might be present. So if we're looking at the inferior mediastinum, so we can divide that into an anterior compartment, which you can see is really not a whole lot there. We've got a middle part, which is pretty much just our heart. So we're going to look at that separately when we talk about the heart. And then you have your posterior, and there's a lot more going on in the posterior inferior mediastinum to look at. So just be mindful of that further subdivision, and really it's the heart that kind of separates our inferior mediastinum into the major components. So if you're thinking and keeping track, we have superior and inferior mediastinum. Superior is one whole thing, and inferior is going to be divided into anterior, middle, and posterior components. All right, so let's take a look at the organs of the mediastinum. We already talked about the trachea, so that was in our Viscera 1 lecture with lungs. Now let's take a look at the esophagus and thymus. The esophagus is going to be the major transport organ for food from our oral cavity into our stomach, and that'll go into more detail when you cover the abdominal structures, particularly the stomach. But what about the thymus? So the thymus is kind of a weird organ. It's a lymphoid organ, and we talked about that in our intro sessions, right? And this is going to be one that's going to be, during development, it's going to supply a lot of our lymphoid cells. But after we're born, it kind of starts becoming redundant, and it slowly starts becoming a fatty structure. So you don't really see a lot of thymal glands in older people. It's really just sort of, it's just like a fatty area hanging out right around the top of the heart here. And just not get confused, this is your thyroid, this is your thymus here. So it just kind of gets replaced by fat, and it just sort of resides there. Now you can get tumors of the thymus, thymic carcinomas, thymomas, things like that. So some of the residual tissue can still become problematic, but you don't see a lot of this stuff in older individuals. As far as the arteries go, so here's our aortic arch. And then you'll see that split over, and as soon as it starts going down, we call it the thoracic aorta. But the main vessels that we're talking about in the superior mediastinum is just going to be that arch plus the major vessels that come off of it, which is going to be our brachiocephalic artery. Now, notice we only have one brachiocephalic artery. We don't have a right versus left because this is going to be eventually supplying the right subclavian and the right common carotid. Whereas on the left side, we have those directly coming off of the aorta. So you have your left subclavian and your left common carotid. But those are the three main branches, and we classify those as being part of our superior mediastinum. You got a couple of veins, so you should be able to see your brachiocephalic veins. My little arrows are off in this diagram, and hopefully they're not off in your notes. I'm running this on Google Slides. So these are not brachiocephalic veins. That's actually part of the lung. The brachiocephalic veins are actually going to be up here. So you get your internal jugular and your subclavian come together, and you create a brachiocephalic vein. You get two brachiocephalic veins, a left and a right, and those are going to come to make your superior vena cava. Okay, so again, disregard these arrows. They're a little all over the place, but just follow my finger, and I could try this pointer thing. Let's see if this works. Kinda. It's really weird because it's a red pointer for me, but for you guys it looks kind of. So subclavian, jugular, merge to form brachiocephalic. Both brachiocephalics merge to form superior vena cava, and thus the circle of blood continues. All right, so the vagus nerve you're actually going to see passing along the anterior surface of the aortic arch. So you'll kind of see that dip down. And as a result of that arch, what's going to actually happen is that our left recurrent laryngeal is going to branch off on the left side and actually wrap around the aorta. It's a little bit higher on the right, so it's not. It's actually going to wrap around the subclavian because we don't have the arch. And so that's why we classify the left recurrent laryngeal as being in the superior mediastinum, whereas the right is really more of a neck structure. So if you're talking about things in the neck, when we do that unit, we might be talking about identifying the right recurrent laryngeal. But you should be able to see, and this photo is trying to highlight, so the anterior surface here is our vagus nerve, and then coming off the vagus is going to be that left recurrent laryngeal. Now it's going to come up and go innervate the larynx superiorly. So this is actually an issue. And I don't even want to call it an issue. It's just a curiosity from developmental standards. So just be mindful of that. That's only the one structure, and that's one of those weird ones where I would require people to have to designate left versus right on that because they are so unique. All right, so that is our superior mediastinum. Pretty straightforward. A couple of those nerves we already looked at. Remember, we looked at the phrenic already. You guys are going to look into more detail with the vagus, especially as we see some of the, we saw the parasympathetic fibers going to the lung. We'll look at it going to the heart as well. And then the sympathetic fibers forming those plexuses. So we'll get into more details with those specific organs. And that's kind of it. It's really just kind of a passer-by point for a lot of structures, just kind of passing through. So next, let's go into the inferior component. And the first thing we're going to talk about in the inferior mediastinum is the middle mediastinum. And like I said, that one, the big bad there, or the thing to really think about is going to be your heart structure. So I gotta recalibrate myself here. So that heart in the middle. Okay, so your main organ is the heart, and the pericardium as well. So it's really just a sac surrounding the heart, and we'll see that it works really similar to the parietal and visceral pleura that we saw in the lung. As far as arteries go, we classify the ascending aorta, which is going to be just the portion that comes right out of the heart. The pulmonary trunk, same thing, comes right out of the heart. Those are still classified as being part of that middle mediastinum. They're kind of partially involved in that pericardial sac. And then you're also going to get pericardial copharyntic arteries, which are going to be like right up against the lateral edges there, kind of along the outside of your pericardial sac. So we saw those. They're going to supply blood to our mediastinal parietal pleura, as well as part of our diaphragm. As far as veins go, pretty much just the contral veins the opposite veins of what we saw with the arteries. So we got to get the pericardial copharyntic veins. Same thing, kind of on the lateral aspect of the heart. So those ones are usually, if you see veins and arteries just sort of hanging on the side of the pericardium, think pericardial copharyntic. Pulmonary veins, and the superior vena cava. So pulmonary veins are just going to be dumping all the oxygenated blood into the left atrium. And then the superior vena cava was the merger of the left and right brachiocephalic. As far as nerves, really the only nerve that we'll see kind of also running alongside the pericardial sac is our phrenic nerve. So that should be just sort of like lying right there. So you should be able to identify that in an opened up body, I should say. All right, so we'll go into more detail in our fourth thorax lecture for the heart. So for the time being, just kind of stick a pin in the middle mediastinum, and let's talk about the anterior. There's really not a lot going on. You can see in this sagittal view here, the anterior is really just that green stuff. Not a lot. Organ-wise, thymus can kind of dip into the anterior mediastinum, but a lot of times in adults, it's kind of regressed to fatty tissue, so it might not even be present, but we'll include it. Really no major arteries or veins to be mindful of, just some of the accessory branches of the lymphatic system going into the thoracic duct, and as well as some of the branches from the internal thoracic just kind of innervating, or sorry, not innervating, but supplying blood to things like the parietal pleura and such like that, the intercostals. You'll just see some of those reside there, but there's really nothing of significance in the anterior mediastinum. It's really just kind of a stopping point, a space before the sternum that we divide into. So here you can kind of see, again, we see the thymus dipping down a little bit, and then you can see on the sternum component, if we were to remove that sternum, just behind that we'd have some portions of the internal, sorry, not internal, but the intercostals, anterior intercostal arteries being found in there. But that's just kind of what's happening here, is some of these branches come off are basically classified as being part of that anterior mediastinum. And then finally, posterior mediastinum. This one has a lot going on. So some of the stuff we talked about with our thoracic wall will make an appearance here again. And some of the other structures that are making their way back in or down into the abdominal cavity are going to be passing through. So it's a lot of passing through organs and structures like we saw with the superior. But now it's kind of in the posterior wall. So things to make note of: the esophagus again. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that, but it's just basically that food tube going towards the stomach, and that's where it's going to make its way down in there. As far as arteries, we classify the thoracic aorta as being part of the posterior mediastinum. So once you've split that arch and start diving down, now we're in the posterior mediastinum, and now it is the thoracic aorta. So after we've had that, those three branches come off and we start diving downward. The veins, so if you remember the azygous system I talked about in the thorax wall unit, that's all going to be part of your posterior mediastinum. As far as nerves go, the vagus actually kind of hangs back there, making its way, and for the sympathetic fibers, we're going to see that kind of make its way down towards the abdominal structures as well. A lot of parasympathetic innervation coming from that. And our sympathetic trunk is located on that, and that's going to be a bilateral structure on either side of the vertebral bodies that you should be able to see. Additionally, a thoracic duct is something you're going to see. It's just only one structure, so we don't talk about it being left versus right. And that's something you're also going to see in the posterior, usually kind of hanging on the midline, occasionally on the left side. I think it does tend to be in it, but usually you see it laying right on the middle of the spinal cord there, or spinal column. All right, so let's take a quick look at the esophagus. Like I said, you'll get into more details on this structure when you get into the abdominal structures, but it's going to basically be a continuing tube from the oral cavity. You saw it posterior to the trachea for most of the way, and for the most part it's going to be the most posterior structure, but eventually the aorta is going to kind of ride behind that. So you'll see the esophagus kind of move forward as it gets closer to the abdominal region and enter the stomach, whereas the aorta is going to move back towards the back of the body there, and basically right along the side of the spinal column. The azygous system, so this should just be reviewed, but you should be able to see that. Again, remember that the azygous system, or the azygous vein, is going to be the one on the right side, and then you have your hemiazygous on the left side. The hemiazygous is then further divided into an accessory, A being above, so accessory should be above, and then just hemiazygous. And those are going to drain our posterior intercostals. And then get those into the caval system there. So you should be able to see those in the posterior mediastinum, assuming you take out the heart and look at all those structures. They'll be kind of sitting there, and they should be basically behind the part of the endothoracic fascia. You're gonna have to peel away some of that fascia. Okay, so let's take a look at the posterior mediastinal nerves. So the two main ones are vagus and the sympathetic trunk. So if you see on this image here in your notes, the sympathetic trunk's easy to find. You just basically look on the lateral aspect of the spinal cord, and you'll see those sympathetic ganglion, chain ganglions, those little nubbins kind of hanging off there. So that should be pretty easy. You'll see that bilaterally. And the vagus nerve is just going to be this one that kind of rides along the anterior aspect of the aorta. All right, and that's going to be parasympathetic fibers, and our sympathetic chain, go figure, is sympathetic fibers. So this is this is continuous with our cervical and lumbar chains, and we'll actually also see this give off the splanchnic nerves. So you get greater, lesser, and then least splanchnic nerves, and those will be seen branching towards the anterior aspect. So if you basically see if my body is a spine, you see the sympathetic fibers, sympathetic chains going down, and then splanchnic fibers are going to come anteriorly and start giving off some of those sympathetic fibers for the plexuses that you see on the various organs. We see more of those. Those again will be something you'll go into in the abdominal structure, because that's where a lot of those splanchnic structures are going to go and do those preganglionic fibers. There's a in situ view. Again, you can see sympathetic chain here. It's kind of the biggest thing to kind of note from there. I don't think you can make out the vagus. But they do have the splanchnics, greater splanchnic coming down. You can kind of see those fibers going anteriorly. Okay, the final thing we can take a look at is the thoracic duct. And this is the largest lymphatic channel in the body. And what it's going to primarily do is drain everything in the body but the right upper quadrant, which gets drainage into its own kind of system here. So you'll see the thoracic duct. It typically is going to be on the midpoint on the spinal column. It can veer a little bit to the right sometimes as it comes up, but it'll drain itself into basically the left brachiocephalic. Usually you see it come in the image here, basically shows it entering at the junction between the left internal jugular and the left subclavian, which is where the left brachiocephalic forms. But like I said, it's going to drain everything. So this is a big vessel, big drainage, and then the right side basically just drains itself into its right subclavian, right internal jugular region there. Very, very big blood vessel. So it should be something that you can easily see. It kind of looks like a vein. So remember, our ducts look like, or lymphatic ducts look like vein structures. They have valves. So just be mindful of that, but it is not bilateral. So usually you'll just see the singular structure kind of laying on the spinal column there. All right, now I know I mentioned apertures and things like that a couple of times. This is one of your objectives. Really, this is just saying the opening and the entrance and exit of your thoracic cavity. So we talk about things having a superior thoracic aperture, which is just up here. It's bounded by T1 for T-bone body, the manubrium of your sternum, and then your first rib. So it really just makes that entrance, and everything is going to go through there, pass through the thoracic aperture, and we call that the thoracic inlet. There's also the inferior thoracic aperture, which is basically the anatomic output. And the only reason we say anatomic is a lot of times in clinical setting, they'll refer to the anatomic inlet or the superior aperture as the clinical outlet, right? Because all the blood's coming out of that region. So when we're looking at the inferior aspect, That's basically just the costal margin there. So you got the xiphoid process, you got the T12 vertebral body posteriorly, and then the rest of that costal margin, basically where the diaphragm is. Everything coming out of that is going through the anatomic thoracic outlet. And the only structures that really leave the thoracic outlet are your esophagus, your inferior vena cava, and your thoracic aorta. A couple of the other ones will basically ride on the coattails of those main structures, but those are the three ones that will let themselves be basically opened or make a passageway through the diaphragm. And here, so this is something worth knowing, is that there's very specific spots. So the first one to leave is also the one that's more towards the midline of the body, is your caval or vena cava system. So your inferior vena cava exits about T8. And that's sort of the like midpoint of your central tendon of the diaphragm. Next, you get your esophagus. Or remember, the esophagus kind of starts dipping towards as it gets towards the stomach. So it's going to move a little more anteriorly. So that's actually going to leave a little bit sooner at T10. And then finally, your aortic, which is going to be the last structure to leave your thoracic cavity through the aperture, is going to be at T12, which is very, very much the bottom of the aperture. And you'll see that in the abdominal structures too. If you're looking at the posterior wall of the abdominal, you'll see a lot of the crust from the diaphragm basically wrapping themselves around the aorta as it makes its way into the abdominal aortic range. So this is basically just reiterating, clinicians will call the inlet the outlet, so just be mindful of that. But for anatomic terms, for this class, just be mindful when I say inlet, I actually mean the superior aperture. When I say outlet, I mean the inferior aperture. But that is it. So that's Viscera Part 2. So join me now when we do the heart next. Thank you, and let me know if you have any questions.